Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to the Hamburg Institute for Social Research for the opening lecture tonight, opening of the lecture series Im Nebel des Krieges, in the fog of war, which will run for 2 semesters. The series has been conceived by the Institute's researchers, above all Stefan Maltana, who is among us, and on the one hand, for the reason, of course, because of the current situation, as the Russian war of aggression on Ukraine has been in the focus of world politics, as well as in the center of various debates for more than a year now. And unfortunately, the topicality of the subject has been confirmed by the recent mass murderous attack on Israel by Hamas. On the other hand, the conception of the series also has to do with the history of our institute, which was founded in 1984 and will therefore celebrate its 40th birthday next year. As you probably all know, the institute's work has always focused on violence in its various forms. So it is no coincidence that the event that really made the HIS famous was the exhibition on the crimes of the Wehrmacht, which was conceived here in this building more than 25 years ago. But genocidal violence perpetrated by Germans was, of course, only one topic that the Institute staff dealt with. It was violence in its most diverse forms that has attracted the attention of our researchers. The Vietnam War and colonial wars were as important for them as was sexual violence in armed conflict or terror and protest movements and its violent repression by the state. The HIS has made a name for itself not only, but not least, through research on violence. And we want to continue this tradition with this current lecture series by having a lecture every 3 or 4 weeks over the next 10 months on a wide variety of empirical and theoretical aspects of current and past wars. The topic will be war-related dynamics of violence as well as the role of money in armed conflicts, the post-war period with its traumas and consequences for the politics of memory, as well as the images of war provided by mass media. Of course, the lecture series will not be fun due to the subject matter, but it will, I can promise you, provide immensely exciting insights into themes that are often conveyed in an all too simplified manner by the mass media. And we are starting this lecture tonight in a way that could not be better imagined. Today's guest at the HIS and tonight's speaker is the British-American sociologist Michael Mann, currently perhaps the most important and best-known representative of historical sociology worldwide, and one of those sociologists who has dealt with the topic of state power and warlike violence as intensely like no other before him. It is not the first time that Michael Mann has been here at the Institute. He was the first winner of the Siegfried Lanshut Prize, which he received here in 2018. Therefore, perhaps no need for a long introduction. Michael Mann, who began his academic career in Great Britain, but has been researching and teaching at the University of California, Los Angeles since the 1980s, became famous very early on with his extensive study, The Sources of Social Power, the first volume of which was published in 1986, a theoretically highly ambitious history of power from the ancient empires to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain in the 18th century. This study became so influential not only because Mann processed and systematically arranged an enormous wealth of historical material in it, but also because he clarified questions of power in a very fundamental way and reflected on the relationship between class and state formation in a manner that was a kind of eye-opener for many social scientists. Further volumes were to follow, so that Mann was then actually able to present a kind of world history of power from its beginnings to the present, a gigantic effort that he would finally conclude with the 4th volume of The Sources of Social Power in 2013. But that was not all. During the more than 25 years of work on The Sources of Social Power, these 4 volumes, Mann published a whole series of important other books, again those that were to become enormously influential. I will mention only 2 here. Fascists, published in 2004, a large and comparative study of the socio-political origins of fascists and political mass murderers, and The Dark Side of Democracy, Explaining Ethnic Cleansing, a study of the consequences and side effects of the idea of democratic equality and a united people, which often in history led to ethnic cleansing when those who saw themselves as members of the demos did not want others to join them. This latter book has also been published in our publishing house, the Hamburger Edition, under the title The Dark Side of Democracy, Die dunkle Seite der Demokratie, and that provides me with a keyword for today's lecture. Michael Mann's latest book has just been published by Yale University Press 2 months ago, and its title is somehow short and sweet, On Wars, a book that will fortunately, in fact, soon in May 2024, be published again in German translation by the Hamburger Edition. And I'm very pleased, we are very pleased, that Michael Mann will now present some of his insights from his new book. His lecture is entitled, Are Wars Rational? Please welcome Michael Mann.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. I have been here before, so I'm glad to be back again. This is On Wars, published in English already, and this is actually the cover of what it will be in German. Very similar design. I am going to talk about Are Wars Rational, but that is 1/3 of what I'm going to do. I've got 3 main arguments. The first one is about the general nature of wars, which I'm not going to be backing up. I'm just presenting this as a set of statements. Wars are ubiquitous, but they're not universal. They're not genetically hardwired into humans or indeed into men. They're the product of societies with states and stratification by class and gender. In fact, in human existence on the Earth, there were probably no wars for about 90% of that time. That is, before the emergence of states and social stratification. Even afterwards, there are far more years of peace than war. When you read these statistics about there being 1.5 wars every year in Europe, you've got to remember that that was over a period when there might be 200 states in Europe, so the vast majority of them didn't have an experience of war in a given year. It's rather noticeable that there has been a systematic over-recording of wars, from ancient annals to modern media. That is, that war is considered more exciting. Peace is boring. Tomorrow is the same as today. But wars have rapid developments, unexpected often, and so they're worth recording. So we get a sense of wars being more important than they are. Of course, in our own era, we've created the possibility that the human society might be destroyed totally by war. And then, of course, I would have to change the general tenor of my remarks. It must be noted that the importance of war in history has been generally in terms of the development of empires. And all of those civilizations which we recognize in earlier times were created by wars and the absorption of other people by the dominant group. And the last point here is that there's no trend to more or less war. I'll say something about the 19th century in a moment. The second point that I'll be making is that most wars are irrational in terms of means, ends, or both. Decisions of war actually blend rational elements with a number of others: ideology, emotions, domestic politics, and what I call baked-in culture and institutions. That is the tyranny of history. And very few wars pay, as we will see. The third is that war and peace decisions are made by a small group of people, rulers and their entourage. Decisions are generally taken in authoritarian regimes by rulers and their coterie of adherents. But that's also true in democracies. In monarchy, oligarchy, democracy, whatever, they're all alike in that very few people are involved in making wars. And that is essentially because their people are not interested in two senses. That is, they feel they have no vital interests at stake in foreign policy, unlike domestic policy, and they are simply not interested. So they are there to be manipulated by rulers in this respect. So it's not states or peoples that make wars, it's rulers. Now, my study, it's a big book, as you can see, has two types of data in it. The first is that I use the Correlates of War project, which political scientists have developed, on wars since 1816. That is, in the modern period, they can generally find statistics on various aspects of war, how long they last, what are the fatalities, etc., on all wars since 1816. Of course, they have to define war, and they define it in terms of 1,000 battlefield deaths in a single year, which is biased against colonial and proxy wars. That is, they don't get recorded. Now, this returns me to the 19th century. Many political scientists and historians have argued that the 19th century comprised either one relative period of peace or two broken by the wars of the 1850s and 1860s. And neither of those is correct if we include wars in which fewer than 1,000 people per year died. The vast majority of colonial wars were repeated series of skirmishes with fewer casualties in any single one of them, but the total casualties would be larger, much larger. And if we add those, there's no tendency in the 19th century towards peace. And of course, the 20th century is the bloodiest century ever in terms of war. And now, once again, we're facing wars. That's the first source of information, together with a brief criticism of that data. The second, and more important one for me, really, is that I deal with all well-documented wars throughout history. They have to be well documented so that I can say things about them. That means I study the Roman Republic, though not the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic ancient and imperial China, Japan, which is mainly from 1500 onwards, and Europe in its millennium. And then pre- and post-colonial South and Central America, which means the pre-colonial are peoples like the Aztecs and the Inca, and post-colonial means wars between the newly independent republics of Latin America. And finally, the USA from the Civil War to today. And I'm particularly interested in wars as historical sequences, not individual cases. The Correlates of War project is a statistical enterprise in which each case is considered autonomously from others. But wars come in historical sequences. My focus here is on wars of aggression. There are too many different kinds of war to deal with them all in a short lecture. So that means that I'm not interested in cases where there is a kind of mutual escalation or a confused escalation, and many of them are confusing cases. I'm interested in aggressors, though they, of course, all normally claim to be provoked. That is, they're not the real aggressor, and of course that's true of Russia too today. Now, the dominant theory in the study of war is political science realism. Realism tends to have two main concepts, anarchy and rationality. Anarchy means there's no international law, virtually no international law, whereas all states have domestic forms of law. Even if that's only the will of the ruler, there is a rule of law. So you get anarchy abroad, and that means that you can't trust anyone, and you fear other states, and so you build up your forces in defense, and they do the same, and wars start. Well, that's quite a good theory, actually. I'm not going to be dealing with that today. I'm going to be dealing with the other aspect, which is rationality. Now, there are two types of realism. There are defensive realists, and they say that states prioritize survival in an anarchic world, and they calculate as best they can the means of ensuring this. Aggressive realists say that states calculate on a number of items: economic and strategic profit from war, set against the cost in terms of both treasure, money, and lives, and then the likelihood of victory. Because obviously, whatever your calculation, if in the end you decide you're not going to win, you should not rationally make war. Now, that involves 5 different metrics, and that makes calculation extremely difficult. How do you set loss of lives against possible profit? And the likelihood of victory is not always possible to calculate. But of course, there is one simplification there. Few rulers are risking their own lives, and none have done for several hundreds of years. And they are therefore sacrificing other people's lives. They are, I like to call them, desk killers. And of course, they're almost all old men, sending out young men to face possible death. Well, in testing aggressive realism, there is one simple test we can make. Do aggressors win? Now, obviously, sometimes they don't because of the problems of battles. Well, as Wellington said, you never know what's on the other side of the hill. Right? And in the 6 major battles of the 100 Years' War between England and France, they were all decided by unexpected either natural environment or unsuspected troops in a position where they were not expected by the enemy, so that they were very difficult to predict. But one could get a statistic from the Correlates of War project, and there have been 4 main studies, and if we average their findings, because they disagree to some extent and they cover the period of research from the 1940s to the 2000s, then we find, averaging them, that aggressors win about half the time. And about half the time they're either defeated or they fight very costly wars of attrition with no victor. Now, those are not very good odds, and one must question whether human reason is really at work here if the odds are so bad. Would you go to war with only a 50% chance of winning? It's like, I suppose, setting up a small business, because most people fail at that, but they're eternally optimistic, and so rulers are eternally optimistic. And of course, calculating the odds of victory is extremely difficult. For Clausewitz, war was a gamble, he said, and battle was uncertain. So there's some doubt here. Now, if we turn to some of my historical examples, well, this is what we find. In the Latin American post-colonial wars, which is in a sense a system of states and sequences and the like, the aggressors lost 6 times, won 2, with 5 costly stalemates. And also, in all the wars except for 2, the person who initiated the war, whether they won or lost, was thrown out of office or killed at the end of the war. So it didn't benefit the rulers in the end. Now, you can also put the wars of Song dynasty China together. 7 wars of aggression. 2 were won by China. 4 were lost against barbarians or ex-barbarians. And 1 costly stalemate. Those odds are worse. But it has to be said that other Song rulers avoided wars and concentrated on economic and social development. And as is well known, Song dynasty China almost broke through to an industrial revolution centuries before Western Europe did. So for Song China, peace was decidedly better than war. Now, there were, of course, persistent winners, where you might think that war was rational. But if we look at those persistent winners, we find a particular reason for it. The persistent winners in my study were Rome, Roman Republic, and 2 dynasties of China, the Yuan and the Qing. And the reason that they won is they were willing to make greater sacrifices of life, that is, the rulers were willing to make greater sacrifice of life than their enemies did. For example, Rome faced by Carthage, an equivalent power. Hannibal invaded Italy, won battles against the Romans. The Romans responded by raising new legions, raising them and persistently raising them, whereas the Carthaginian rulers put pressure on Hannibal to come back out of Italy and try and seek a truce with Rome. So it's a different metric for these countries. Why? Because militarism was built into their structure and their institutions and their culture, so that high political office only came to people who'd served in the legions for 7 or more years, that all senators had commanded troops, even Cicero, and it's a thoroughly militarized society in which war is more normal. Indeed, countries, I don't like using the word state, countries vary considerably in the culture and institutions as to how militaristic they are. Obviously, in German history, there have been a couple of highly militaristic sets of rulers, in Prussia and then in the 20th century. Now, I haven't got a comparable case total for European aggressors. The data are too difficult. Evan Luard, who has written a book about it, says that most European aggressors lost. And in their case, the calculation was undermined by status, honor, and domestic politics. For example, Henry V was not quite as Shakespeare portrayed him. He was a young man considered to be weak when he acceded to the throne, and he went to war to prove that he could do it for his honor. And that is typical of European monarchical history, and indeed of monarchical history in other continents as well. Indeed, in feudal Europe, the ruler decided to go to war and then called out his barons, and he couldn't be sure how many were going to respond, how many troops there would be. Once they assembled, he could figure out how many ships they needed and what provisions they needed, etc. That was the quartermaster stage is the most rational part of war making, where they try and figure out, and they obviously do it in very careful detail, figure out the supply systems. But the king had decided to intervene, and so honor required that you set off with whatever troops you could have, you could find. Of course, in monarchies, many of the wars are wars of succession. That is, contested succession between different claimants. And in these, there can only be one winner, and there's generally more than one, sometimes several losers. And of course, most notably, the aggressors lost in World War I and World War II. And of course, in World War II, it was clearly ideology which drove them along. Now, there are exceptions to these, and there are two kinds of exception. One is what I call sharks against minnows, as in many cases of imperial expansion, that is when a major power attacks a very minor one with predictably success. Right? And so they are an exception. But then it's so easy to calculate because the difference in power is so great. So that the US, which has had a very dismal post-1945 record of wars, could win against Grenada and Panama, minnows, but stalemate in Korea against formidable foes, losses in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. Not a very good record. But why? Well, the proximate reason is over-optimism. They'd all expected to win, so why did half or less than half actually win? And now I switch to defensive realism. That is where rulers pursue wars to guarantee the survival of their state. But the reality of history is that very large majorities have not survived. Now, China started with at least 70 states, sorry, the first post-Zhao China, at least 70 states, nobody knows exactly how many, and ended up several hundred years later with just one, and that one survived for a very long time. 16th century Japan started with, again, one doesn't know how many, but there were certainly 200 little statelets. Ended up at the end of the 17th century with only one, the state that we know as Japan. In Europe, there were probably over 300 states in early medieval times. By the 20th century, it was down to around 30, where it has more or less remained since that. So the vast majority of states fail at defensive realism. Now, there are 3 studies of why. They're not brilliant studies, I have to admit that. But what they all say together is defeat in battle is the main cause, followed by submission to threats of violence by a bigger state, and then thirdly, the least common, there are various agreements, generally agreements of marriage or inheritance contracts, that if a ruler dies without heirs, he may have already made an agreement with a neighboring state to be taken over. Though actually that third one is probably the most important among the Inca and the Aztecs. They were not quite as warlike as the general impression, and though they did defeat some enemies in battle, and they did threaten others into submission, the most common thing was an agreement about intermarriage normally. So again, over-optimism. Why? Well, first of all, we've got to show, I've been asserting that rulers make the decisions. I have to show that that was the case, in fact. The choice to use military power is a choice to use it rather than economic, ideological, or political power, because these are my 4 sources of social power that I've used in my work. Use military power to achieve their goals. But of course, their choices are constrained by traditions. And the traditions really play a large part in this. Now, monarchies and other authoritarian regimes, the choice is clearly made by the ruler and his entourage. The people are irrelevant, except that these rulers are sometimes a little cautious, fearing that higher taxes and conscription, which would follow any prolonged war, which would not follow, but which would take place in any long war, may produce discontent and revolt. So that's a factor restraining war. But democracies are similar. The executive takes decisions, whatever the constitution. The people lack interest, as I've noted already, and they can be easily manipulated by the executive. And because people have very little knowledge to set against the knowledge that the ruler is claiming about the threat posed by another state. So if rulers claim that a state is threatening us, well, they're generally believed because people have no alternative sources of knowledge. Indeed, the manipulation can last for about 2 years of war. You know, there's a rally round the flag, and it's carried along. After that, things may become problematic. Troops may refuse to do things, and there may be some opposition emerges suggesting making peace. So what I'm saying here is that democracy might work well for domestic policy issues where people do have deep interests, though we can obviously see cases where they seem to make very puzzling choices indeed. But anyway. An example. It is an extreme example, but it matters to our contemporary world. In 2001, Congress passed, post 9/11, Congress passed the Authorization to Use Military Force Act, which meant that the president could use military force independently of the Congress if the president believed that the opposition constituted terrorists or threats to the country. Now, this is an astonishing statistic, really. By 2018, this had been used 41 times by presidents against 19 countries. It's still in force. So in the United States, the president has a great deal of latitude that has increased through time because, as you probably know, American entry into World War II was very closely fought, and Roosevelt eventually succeeded in manipulating his way, except that, of course, the United States was attacked by Japan, which was the actual push over into war. In the UK, the decision is made in Parliament. But the Prime Minister can manipulate it, can manipulate the factual situation, as Tony Blair did, and managed to persuade his Labour Party as well, or majority of the Labour Party, as well as Conservatives, to enter into the Iraq War. Now, of course, in a country like Germany, it doesn't make war anymore, so this kind of thing doesn't happen. Oh, yeah, okay. All right. So what are the ruler's motives? Well, I will... rulers are constrained by various things, domestic politics. They can go to war in order to shore up their domestic position, so they believe. Or by culture, institutions, which are either more or less militaristic. And so war is very variably baked in to societies. That is, a very minor threat to the Roman Republic will elicit a formidable response. But that isn't true of all states through history. Now, in terms of motives, historians tend to emphasize, they tend two groups, greed and glory. And greed is economic, but also the desire for territory, increased territory and sovereignty for their own sake. and glory, wanting to be remembered as a great conqueror. And of course, we do remember great conquerors. I mean, we may think of Attila the Hun as an extremely bad guy, but he's not regarded that way in Hungary, and similarly with all of the others. Almost all the others. Well, the non-material motives are very important. Glory, status, honor, which are shared by contending rulers. So there's a general occurrence of don't back down. That shows weakness. Also, there's the enjoyment, I would add, as Nietzsche argued, the enjoyment of domination over others as a goal in itself. The sheer enjoyment the great conquerors had in conquering and obtaining submission from other kings on the ground, kissing their feet and getting glory as a result. In the US, there's just about still the ideology of the US is the greatest power on earth, and therefore any threat to any American around the world will be treated with great severity. And then in addition, some wars are driven by religion, like the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, mainly Germany, in which German losses were extraordinarily high. Or it may be racial, or it may be political ideologies, as in fascism against liberal capitalism, democratic capitalism. So in those cases, it's clearly driven by non-rational elements. Now, I've actually altered this. Pascal didn't say God of the gaps. 19th century theologians did, right? That's a mistake which I have discovered. Our scientific knowledge is necessarily limited. We don't understand everything about the world. We don't understand the question of life and death. We don't understand the meaning of life. And in order to act, we act on the basis of ideologies, values, emotions, which fill in the gaps in the knowledge. And that's what ideological power does. It fills in the gaps so that you can act with some confidence and believe that the facts do support you, but there has been a leap of faith. It permits action amid uncertainty and anxiety. And then finally, there is over-optimism. Now, here I like to think of this as a kind of dark side of Durkheim. That is, he emphasized the normative solidarity of society, and there's a substantial point in it, and I think the war data backs him up. But that means that leads to society being a cage. You're caged, imprisoned by the values of your society, by your faith in the others in your society, and you are ignorant of other societies, and you often have contempt for them. That is, that you are superior to them, perhaps with superior fighting power or whatever, but you are ignorant of the enemy, and you underestimate the enemy. In fact, rulers have devised their estimates of the strength of the other from rather dubious sources. Claims that the others' army is in great discontent. Or there's a famous example in Imperial China where the emperor dies and his widow takes over power. And with a woman in charge, you attack them. You attack China. But what they didn't appear to know was that this woman had already led armies into battle and, in fact, repulsed the barbarian attack. And it's very noticeable that because of the values of your own society, there's a self-righteousness about your right to achieve victory and whatever is involved in that. And we see this very markedly in the Ukraine. I'll come on to that at the end. And they believe in the justice of their cause. Now, the English word should, I don't know if this is, someone can tell me whether this is true in German as well. The expression should is ambiguous. It means two different things. One, we should win this war because we have right on our side. It's morally right. It's should is about morality. Right? But should also means an assessment of relative strength. We should win this war because we're stronger than they are. And these two get confused all the time, where the sense of self-righteousness interferes with the ability to calculate whether you're actually going to win. Now I come on to the Russia-Ukraine war. The book was published in August, but I wrote the last words on the Ukraine in October of the previous year. So I don't claim that this is an in-depth analysis of the contemporary situation. But it is, in many ways, a typical war. It's a typical war of aggression. Putin feeling provoked by NATO expansion. And indeed, he was. Gorbachev had received an assurance that if Russia agreed, well, the Soviet Union, if it agreed to the unification of Germany, that NATO would not expand any further eastward. And of course, Gorbachev fell. NATO did expand eastward to the borders of Russia. So that's the provocation, though it's not the only reason. The other thing on Putin's side is he had a recent record of success. And the more you win, the more likely you are to go to war again. Putin and others around him, a lot of Russians, in fact, are contemptuous of the Ukrainians, regard them as an inferior ethnic group, and did not expect them to fight anywhere near as well as they did. Putin also calculated that the US was weak and would not intervene because the US has had such bad military experiences in the last 20 years. Well, he was right that American troops would not get involved, but he was wrong in that it was a proxy war. And so America provided massive military aid to the Ukraine without losing a single American death. So it was a proxy war, and he failed to see that the Americans had that option. So for that reason, it turned out not to be a shark against a minnow, which Putin had expected. Of course, we all know this, right? Now, both the US and Russia have had war sequences which have differed rather markedly, but nonetheless, well, anyway, Russia had had a series of victories in Chechnya, in Georgia, and then in Syria. And so, and of course there's now another one in Azerbaijan and the Armenian conflict, because Russia has clearly become the dominant power over almost all of the former Soviet Union, because both Belarus and Kazakhstan have appealed to Russian power to help them, the rulers, survive. So we have the Soviet Union back again over almost all its territories, not all of them, but Putin thought he could keep going. And that's fairly obvious. Now, the US is a little different because it had suffered a number of defeats. But, of course, there's no question that it would combat Russian expansion as it had done ever since 1945, and that it did it by fighting a proxy war with no casualties. Now, all three of the sides, that is, with NATO, the third side, were self-righteous about this, believed they had a moral right, or the Ukrainians and NATO thought the same right to the same territories. And that's very difficult to make a deal. And so there's obviously going to be a period of, and there already is, a period of stalemate attrition in which neither side wins. It's impossible to predict the outcome of that unless the US and NATO waver, which, of course, if Trump is elected next year, might well happen. But without that, they won't waver very quickly anyway. I want to say something about Russian atrocities now as well. Attacking civilians. Now, these have been normalized in the 20th century. Aerial bombing of civilian cities by all of the great powers. That is, by Germany, Japan, Soviet Union, Britain, the United States. All deliberately targeted civilians on the grounds that that would lower the morale of the other side. I can testify personally to this, not that I have any memory of it. I was born in Manchester in the basement of a hospital on the day of the last German air raid on Manchester. And I don't have very clear memories of that, of course, and that's my only military experience. But after that, they stopped bombing us and we bombed them. So it's perfectly normal. I'm not saying it's desirable, but it's what has been the norm in 20th century warfare, and it has continued after 1945. US bombing of Korea, of North Korea, probably 3 million people died under that bombing. And then there was in Vietnam and Cambodia, and of course Russia in Syria. So such atrocities are kind of normal. I mean, I'm not approving of them, but it's not unusual. And I'd like to add a little thing now about Israel and Hamas. One thing that figures in my book that I haven't mentioned now is that the distinction between ferocious and callous killing. ferocious killing is what characterized most historical societies. That is, you slash the enemy's body. It's a direct, ferocious activity. Ferocity was trained into soldiers. Of course, archers were a little different. They did fire from a distance and not usually at a particular person. But then aerial bombing kills far more people. But it's callous. That is, it's done without thinking. It's not aimed at a particular set of individual targets. And we can see that what Hamas did is a kind of ferocious. That is, they attacked men, women, and children, slaughtered them, which is obviously not something to be approved of. It has to be very strongly disproved. But Israel is, of course, bombing civilians, men, women, and children. The result is the same. It's that one of these practices shocks us deeply today because it's not the norm in warfare, whereas the other one is the norm. Callous killing is the norm. And since you don't know who you've killed, you don't necessarily have much of a conscience about it. So I think that that is a kind of it's a kind of somewhat variant part of the kind of historical analysis. So what I hope I've done to show is that, of course, it's not just the Russian-Ukrainian war that is irrational. It's normal. That is normal. And if you want to draw a moral from this book, the moral is rulers should read my book. Thank you.
You want to sit down?
Oh, sure, I'm wired here, aren't I?
So, Michael Mann, thank you very much for this wonderful and thought-provoking, maybe provocative talk. Maybe first a quest on my side in order to clarify something. When you talked about the correlates of war study, you criticized it somehow, saying that they using data with respect to autonomous, isolated war events, and you better preferred to look into historical sequences of wars. What do you mean by that, historical sequences of wars?
I mean that wars tend to be repetitive. That is, if rulers have had success, they'll carry on making wars. Of course, there is a basic level of rationality involved in this, in the sense that if they then suffer defeats, they hesitate to make war again. But that war is not a thing that you can develop causes on a study of individual cases. You have to build in the history, the traditions, and the persistence of war.
Okay. Then maybe a very, very general question. I mean, what you made clear and convincingly clear is that many of the wars, maybe the majority of wars, start with a very irrational background. Rulers are not rational. Now, the question might be, is that a particular topic of politics? Or do you find this kind of irrationality basically in every part of the world? Do CEOs in some big enterprises make the same decisions for very, very irrational reasons? Or is it the case, as you might say, I don't know, the political sphere is a very dangerous, strange sphere in which very, very many difficult motives are coming in, and therefore it's a particularly irrational sphere, in contrast maybe to the economy, in contrast to sports, in contrast to science, etc., etc. Would you say that, or is it just a normal decision-making process within politics?
Well, on the first part of the question, I have no idea whether this would be so of CEOs. I am saying that this is particularly true of war and peace decisions because of the caging effect of societies and the ignorance of what lies over the hill.
Over there, okay.
Right, and so I presume that CEOs study very carefully the market condition. If they're going to expand in another country, they get local experts to, you know, advise them, etc., etc. But that doesn't happen because that would be people, locals who would give advice against their own country would be executed. And so it's this distinctive ignorance of other societies that is a kind of, you know, it's the dark side of Durkheim.
Now, well, we are talking right now in a country which is very proud of its philosophers, and Kant obviously is one of the most important philosophers in our country. And as Germans, probably, we try to believe into the democratic peace thesis. What you made quite clear is that you are not very fond of this kind of thesis. Democracies are not fighting with each other, is not a strong position, according to your opinion. Why? Can you make it more clearly? I mean, one of your arguments was that it's always, even in democracies, a very small circle of people who are making this kind of decisions, because the majority of people are not interested in foreign policy matters. Is that really the case?
Well, yes, but I have to qualify it a little bit,
okay.
In the sense that there are vested interests involved. You know, that if your ethnicity, I mean, Jews in America have very distinctive views about Israel and the Palestinians, and corporations with mining interests in other countries either do or don't want war. I mean, I think that, you know, oil in the Middle East is grossly misinterpreted by most people, because American interventions in the Middle East are not in support of their oil industry. The oil industry didn't want it, and the oil industry is quite happy to accept market terms for what they do. So now that there's no longer imperialism, that is owning the oil companies of foreign countries. And what was the other? Or have I answered?
I thought you were already in the process of answering the question, so
yes.
I don't know whether I had another one.
So yeah, right. So there are exceptions, and clearly ethnicity is one of the obvious things, and so a vested interest. We call them vested interests if you have, you know, mines or oil fields, etc. So I would stand by the generalization, though in the book I qualify it.
And what would you say? Let's talk about Germany. You know, the Germany after 1945. I mean, Germany obviously is always, even the rulers are always very careful not to provoke a kind of military conflict. It took quite a long time. So obviously there are norms within this society which are even very important for the rulers. I mean, our Bundeskanzler is not keen in order to invade Afghanistan or so, or to send military to Afghanistan. He was not very keen of. And probably the current Bundeskanzler is not very keen of sending troops to Israel if Israel wanted to have German soldiers. So there are probably very strong norms. I mean, is Germany in that case a kind of an exception because of the experience of the Second World War and all that, what happened there? Or is it the case that you might underestimate the power of norms, as some theorists of international relations would say?
Well, I think there's a general thing going on here, which you can see clearly in modern, mainly European history, which is that after devastating wars, there is a period of either lesser wars or more rule-governed wars. So after the wars of religion in the 17th century, there follows a century and a half of more gentlemanly wars, where you don't storm cities and level civilians, and where you return prisoners to the other side, etc., where there are rules of battle. And similarly, not similarly, but in a different way, after the Napoleonic Wars, which were devastating, you have this concert of powers trying hard to not have further wars amongst them, and to aim at revolutionary aim against revolutionary movements, because that's associated with the French Revolution. And then after 1945, in Europe, Germany is not the only country which demilitarizes, but Germany is the extreme case. And obviously, I mean, it's a puzzling thing about why Germans have been so guilty, feeling guilty, and Japanese not. But of course, the Japanese aren't intervening elsewhere either. So you've had this, and are we reaching the end of that period of reduction of war? It's a possibility.
Maybe one last question from my side. I mean, what was shocking, certainly, in your talk was to learn that attacking civilians was normal in wars of the 20th century. And I mean, it's hard to accept this kind of statement. And of course, the comparison between Hamas and Israel makes that not easier to accept that.
No, quite.
Could you clarify that a bit?
Well, surely Dresden isn't too far from here. And the Allies sought to destroy it. There was firebombing, as there was firebombing of Tokyo. And before that, Germans had attacked civilian targets in Britain. Of course, bombing was not as precise then, so no doubt they would have preferred to only hit the railroads and the factories. But the effect of, but at the same time, this military tactic developed that we can win this war if we destroy the morale of the other side. And that's why why Dresden was firebombed and Tokyo was firebombed. I mean, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are different. You can make a case that that is a way to end the war more quickly. But at the same time, it is the mass killing of civilians. It was. And this has been the norm. And of course, now the US claims that it has all of the for bombing raids and for drone sending in armed drones, there is supposedly, or every time this happens, there is a lawyer on the team. It's typical American, there's lawyers everywhere. A lawyer on the team who decides whether it's legal. But since the killing of civilians is not legal under international law, I'm not quite sure. Well, of course, there's been these cases where they make understandable mistakes, like at an Afghan wedding party where they were firing their rifles in the air in celebration, and the Americans assume that this is a terrorist group and they bomb the hell out of the wedding party. But yes, I mean, what I said about Israel is, I think the result is the same. Well, actually, it's not, because just like former colonial powers, in 1857, when the Indian troops mutiny in India, they kill about 100 Europeans. And in return, the British Indian Army goes in and executes over 1,000 of them. And you get that disproportion in killings in Israel and Palestine. And at the moment, the deaths of the Palestinians are going to be a lot higher than those of Israel.